Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for joining us from various parts around the world for what should be a very interesting discussion on what financial services institutions need to know about data security and privacy during the pandemic. We've all heard countless examples of the acceleration of digitization and transformation in financial services amid COVID. And we did not want to let Cybersecurity Month get away from us without pulling together an esteemed body of CISOs that can really talk about what they're experiencing and what they're doing to keep the data safe as we go through this unprecedented acceleration into digital for financial services. So with that, I'd like to quickly introduce our moderator, Nathaniel Popper. Nathaniel is a finance and technology reporter for the New York Times based out of San Francisco, does a lot of writing on cybersecurity. We have Neal Pollard. Neal is a group CISO at UBS, where he leads a worldwide team to manage cyber and information security for the world's largest wealth manager. Mathew Newfield. Mathew is a corporate CISO at Unisys, where he is responsible for design, development, and implementation of the company's corporate information and security programs across all regions and functions. And Brian Costello. Brian is a VP of Data Strategy at Envestnet Yodlee, where he is tasked with enabling Yodlee's global data aggregation, financial enablement, and data analytics portfolios. So thank you all for joining us. And Nathaniel, you want to take us away?
Sure. Thank you for having me here, Deidre and Edelman. And thanks everybody for joining us today. While we're talking, attendees, please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A panel down at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we will try to get to some of those as we move through this. But I'm hoping this will be a good conversation. I was hoping to start actually by asking Deidre, Edelman has become an expert on the question of trust. And I wanted to ask Deidre how trust has impacted the financial service industries when it comes to data and security, what we're here to discuss today.
Thank you, Nathaniel. As the financial services sector leader for Edelman, I look after what's on the minds and concerns and interests of our financial services clients. And certainly as it relates to trust building and data security, obviously an enormous issue in terms of what it means to keep my data safe. We know from a recent Boston Consulting Group research report that financial services firms are hit with cyber attacks 300 times more than other industries. And despite that, 75% of respondents to a McKinsey study tell us that they have no interest whatsoever in coming off their digital channels. We're hooked on our digital channels, especially living through a pandemic, and so it's here to stay. But from the Edelman Trust Barometer, we know that 82% of our global respondents tell us that I need financial services to make my life easier, and that often means technology. However, they tell us that in order to maintain my trust, 85% tell us that you must keep my family safe and my data safe, and that in doing so, there are three areas that are most highly expected from financial services to maintain trust, but chief among them is protecting my consumer data, being transparent and socially responsible, and keeping my family safe as also relates to my data, my privacy. And so with that, you can't trust your financial services industries if they can't provide this most basic and most intense and complex solution of keeping data safe in this sort of tough world. So we've brought these experts together that can really tell us what they're facing and what they're doing to keep their clients' data safe.
Great, thanks, Deidre. Well, I guess to get a little bit of a flavor of where Neal, Matt, and Brian are coming from, I wanted to start by asking, since March, since coronavirus showed up in force, what has changed the most at your institutions and in your job? And I think that may be a good place to sort of kick things off. Maybe Neal, you could start by telling us a little bit about UBS and your job and what you've seen.
Sure. So my job is, as Deidre introduced me, is to lead the global team for protecting cyber and information security, assuring cyber and information security for our operations worldwide. And I guess as the first person who gets to answer your question, I get to state the obvious, which is the biggest change is 90% of the workforce working from home. A literal commingling of the workspace and the home space. I was struck by Deidre's point about how important it is take care and protect my family and take care and protect my data. And of course, the latter responsibility is one that we take very seriously for UBS clients naturally. But when people are working from home, their proximity to their family, not necessarily physical danger, but keeping your family safe from the internet, those are much closer than I think we would have expected it to be. Now, with that, which has been arguably, a benefit to the extent that digitalization is a benefit, and digitalization was on the agenda of many companies, certainly financial services, but that's another change I've seen. I know we'll talk about this later, which is the pace of digital transformation and digitization has accelerated quite a bit.
Great. Matt, you want to take it from there?
So I agree with everything Neal said, and I know we'll have some controversy throughout the some conflicts potentially. But one of the other things we're really seeing industry-wide, and you could just take even my own organization out, but in the conversation I've had with our associates as well as others around the world, because people have moved home, because there is less of a separation of that work and personal life, especially in digital, we've seen actually an increase in attacks against people's personal lives, their personal email addresses, their personal phone numbers, trying to get into their business side, because our adversaries understand that we're all working from home. And for a lot of people, if you go down to that base level, that OSI level, and you start thinking of the layers 1 and up, our systems are in our home networks. They may be on the same network as the other devices we have, including home IoT. And we've started to see an increase in requests for, and to Deidre's point, how do I protect the others in my home, their online profiles, with some of the education I've had from the organizations I work for? Because I think people are really coming to grips with the fact that if someone else in my household is exploited, not only can it impact my personal life, right? My bank account, my personal, but it can impact my work as well, which could make a really bad situation way worse.
Fascinating. And Brian, tell us about Envestnet Yodlee and how this is playing out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be here. So in addition to the data strategy, I look after data governance, which is part and parcel of what we're talking about. And I was CISO for 9 years for Envestnet Yodlee during our high growth phase. Nothing controversial in what Neal and Mathew have said. Certainly the level of attacks, the level of threats that come in through the work channel impact home now that we're working from home, and ones that come in through home are working there. And so some of our risk calculus has changed. An organization might have been comfortable with split tunneling for the VPN because for operational reasons, but when because our people only work from home for a little bit of time and so if we do the math, it's not that bad. Now they're working from home 100%. For me, it comes back to the security awareness. When I was CISO, I would tell my people, you put your badge on before you come into the office. That's like putting on your uniform. And that's sort of the visceral physical reminder that I'm at work and I need to behave a little bit differently with my security awareness. Now we're working remotely, we're working asynchronously, and so that switching back and forth is it's a different paradigm, and of course the bad guys are exploiting that. More impactful, and I think this goes to Deidre's question about trust. I forget which study it was, but we want digital channels, and we've always wanted digital channels for convenience. So my personal risk tolerance for potential cybersecurity issues, my trust with my financial services providers, the math there was around convenience. Now I'm balancing the security of my digital channel with the security of my physical channel, my actual health. Do I want to risk going to a branch versus doing something online, where before I didn't mind going to the branch, but now it could kill me? I'm being a little controversial there, but I think that really enters into the math. And I know that we might, I don't know if we'll have conflict on this call, but I think it's also important that we talk about the paradigm of trust and changes in the delivery of financial services, where maybe we weren't quite ready to deliver them at scale, and now we have to, because we can't open the branches, because we have to change the limits, the deposit limits on a remote deposit capture. I mean, these are decisions that shouldn't have been taken lightly, but they were accelerated because of the pandemic.
Yeah, so Brian, you're getting there into the sort of customer facing piece of this. We started by talking about home office employees. I mean, one of the questions I have is, so much of this was already digital. Obviously, data was already digital. What does it change when it accelerates? I mean, you've already lived in a world where you had to secure data digitally, and where most of the data was coming in digitally. What changed when it accelerated? What was the change there? And then, I mean, I'm also interested in, the customers and how the issues are different around customer facing data than around, employee data. Maybe we'll just go in reverse. Brian, you're already thinking about that. So let's start. I
think what changed is choice. So as a financial services customer, I had the choice for how I wanted to engage pre-pandemic, based on my risk tolerance, based on my comfort, based on my digital capability and capacity. I could engage with my mobile app. I can engage online. I could use telephone banking or telephone services if I had 5 or 6 hours to burn, or I could go to the branch. The branch might have actually been convenient. It was on my way to the office or my way to the store. Now, for many, or in this pandemic, for many engagements, my only option is digital, and that it took choice away from me, and it put me perhaps as a consumer, in a uncomfortable position because of my digital capacity or capability, because of just my familiarity with the technology. And in some cases, it put me in a position where I couldn't even exercise a choice because the digital channel wasn't supportive of that. And I gave the example of a deposit limit on a remote deposit capture.
Brian, I think we lost your voice there. Brian, if you want to just back up for 10 seconds.
Yeah, sorry. Not sure what happened there. I was talking about the limit of remote deposit capture, and it really happened to my wife. We were on one. Yeah, I don't know what happened. Why don't you go on? Let me fix this.
I'm wondering if there's a remote capture deposit going on right now while we're watching Brian. No, Matt, do you want to jump in here while Brian gets back up?
Yeah, no problem. So I'll actually expand on what Brian was talking about. Now, the choice has definitely gone away, but let's flip it over from a consumer perspective and then add in the actual financial institution perspective. There were certain things that I was able to do, to Brian's point, online before, always, your day in and day out stuff. But there were also verification checks that I was able to make. I could call the local branch and have a conversation with a particular individual because I knew that individual at the branch. Pandemic comes in, I can no longer access those individuals. And I was able to make that drive into the branch if I wanted to do something more specific, if I wanted to have a conversation with an advisor, for example, and do that privately. A lot of that has gone away, but even in a virtual world, these kinds of scenarios where I can bring up a camera and have a conversation, one of the things that I haven't seen a lot of, and the attackers are quite well aware of that, is how are we securing that down? How are financial institutions ensuring that people like their brokers, people that were sitting behind thick glass, accepting money at or a teller in a branch or a manager in a branch have the same level of security? One of the things we talk about a lot is, especially in finance and financial world, is we went from a scenario, and we'll just use January of 2020 as an example, where most of the employees at financial institutions worked out of very secure networks, right? Very secure environments where people like Brian, people like Neal were able to put their systems in play to make sure to a very high degree that they were secure because they were within the four walls, and it's the virtual four walls of that environment. And now we have these same people doing that same work for people like myself, people like Brian, people like Brian's wife and my family and friends. And they're doing it out of what I consider to be the most hostile networks on the planet, which are their homes, right? And we have got to change our mindsets. It's not just a financial institution thing, it's industry-wide. We have to change our mindsets on how we secure, how we educate, and how we think about the services we're going to deliver. And I'll give you a personal example. I got a phone call from a financial institution I do business with recently, and they started asking me a bunch of questions. And I was very uncomfortable even having the discussion. And I asked a simple question. I said, look, I'm not comfortable since you called me. I'm going to call back in. I have the number of the financial, let me call in. How do I get back to you? And there was silence on the phone. They said, that's not possible. And I said, then we're not speaking, and I hung up. And it shows that particular, and it was nobody on this call, but that particular institution had not thought about security, had not thought about the user experience, and therefore I had a significant problem with. And just to be transparent, I'm going to stop doing business with them. Just because I didn't have a way to complete what I needed to do with me being the initiator instead of the recipient of a call. And it looks like Brian's back, so I'll go on mute.
No, thanks. Let's sorry about that. Let's let's keep going. But those are two examples where the pandemic accelerated the need to digital channels, and depending on the institution, they might not have been ready, or they might have been absolutely ready. But the unintended consequence was reduction of consumer choice, or the requirement to accelerate their trust in the institution. And I think there's a tangent here to talk about trust. Does the average consumer have a consistent level of trust with their institution across everything, or is it differentiated? And I think it's the latter. But I don't want to hijack the whole conversation on that one.
Sure, that's great. And Neal, I mean, I was asking this question of, everything was to some degree digital already. What really changed here? And I guess also, from your perspective, what changed for customers in addition to the, work from home employees, and how you're thinking about customer data and security?
Yeah, I think a lot of good examples my colleagues have provided. The acceleration of digital plans is obviously a change. One statistic I read, I think it was McKinsey, said that what analysts expected to see in digitalization over 5 years has happened in 6 months. So that's a pretty good statistic of what we're talking about acceleration. And that is, we've heard plenty of good examples about how the need for remote solutions, whether it's work from home for the workforce, or e-banking, or taking care of things electronically, the world, and now another reason for going toward a cashless society, for example, there were trends toward that. Now they've been accelerated because of the remote world that we're working in. Security requirements have both accelerated. We've already talked about how we have to abandon the concept that any security that relies on an assumption that the user is within the four walls, digital or physical, of the organization, causes us to accelerate some trends that we're already seeing in security anyway, like abandoning the concept of the perimeter and software-defined perimeters as opposed to firewall-defined perimeters, relying on access and instrumenting data as opposed to instrumenting boxes, virtual desktop interfaces as a way to establish things. Zero trust, the concept of zero trust. I don't know where you are, and right now in the world, it's not important where you are. So if we can accelerate some of our investments that did not assume that knowledge, that you're inside the four walls of a physically protected building that we own, now is a good time to roll out those solutions. So those strategies were vindicated. One strategy I think was vindicated, or at least the importance has been, this has shown the importance of, is in the financial sector, as we said, digitalization was part of the plan for a while. FinTech is a perfect example, which is converting the products and services that financial institutions provide to clients into data and extracting digital value, using analytics or whatever to extract value from that data for the client. The role of cybersecurity there, to put a contributory concept to it, is to be lockstep with the digitalization strategy. So the cybersecurity is there to preserve and extend the value of that data, which is very sensitive to insult, whether it's confidentiality breach or availability breach or integrity breach, of course. So I think the need to embed cybersecurity strategy in a firm's digitalization strategy has been demonstrated pretty strongly. And the balance you got to strike is like all security measures, it adds friction to efficiency. And so the acceleration has to keep pace and has to be part of the digitalization strategy as well.
Yeah, can I just say, I think this conversation is doing a really nice job of pulling together the internal considerations for security and trust, as well as the external, because you have to, as Neal was saying, you have to have those internal security mechanisms in place and able to deliver well on the external and be able to give a good customer experience. So Mathew was talking about a very unfavorable customer experience, and it was living in the fact that data security was at the heart of it. So we know that customer experience is very much highly expected in terms of trust building. We know that the world expects now that financial services has gone full tech, they expect the same customer experience that they get from their tech brands. And so the impetus upon financial services companies to deliver great digital services all comes down to how secure can they be on the back end, and the work that folks like you are doing.
And I'll throw one last thing. It's not only the security, but it's your processes and testing your processes. We have a tendency in my field, in our field, the panelist field of CISOs, we think, how do I protect that which is ours? And how do I put enough, I'm thinking some legacy thoughts here, barriers to make sure adversaries don't get access to that data. If they get access to that data, and there's when you talk about digital transformation, one of the things that when Neal was bringing that McKinsey study up, that we really have to focus on, that digital transformation has also impacted our clients and the average consumer. And we have to make sure that we are reevaluating their experience with our organizations. How are they interacting securely with us? And how can we build that trust? Brian talked a lot about trust here. And do people inherently trust? And I do believe the average consumer around the world inherently trusts most organizations until they read the newspaper, right? Until they watch the local news or the international news, and they see yet again some hotel chain, some credit card, some barbecue place in my area had a breach and lost all the credit cards. And then all of a sudden that trust goes completely away. And if you in financial institution, if you in retail, aerospace, it doesn't matter, haven't thought through how you're going to interact with your customers with a security lens and a client lens, you will fall behind and it will impact your business.
So I'm interested in what some of these threats actually are. I guess I wonder if each of you could tell us, what are the new threats that have come up over the last 7 months, or the threats that have particularly accelerated over the last 7 months, that sort of keep you up at night, both on the employee side, both on the work from home side or whatever other issues we're thinking of on the employee side, and on the customer side. I mean, can you give us a sense, or are they the same? What's keeping you up at night among these new emerging threats? And I don't, Matt, you're already up. So you wanna start us off?
Sure. So there's a few. We've seen a significant rise in vishing attacks. That's vishing with a V. In the past, a lot of our employees and associates that work in our organization sat in a singular building. So if they got a phone call, it was very easy for them to walk up the office. Is that really the CFO? Is that really another finance person or HR person? Did Billy really just send an email from their Gmail account asking us to change their direct deposit information, so on and so forth? And adversaries are well aware that we're all working in these isolated environments. So we've seen an increase in vishing attacks. We've seen an increase in attacks against home networks. And you asked what keeps me up at night. That is one of the things that absolutely was keeping me up at night, is I can protect that which I own and have control over. I can put those boundaries up, but I can't protect your television. I can't protect your home internet router. And I also know that most consumers, most people that I talk to, when you ask them, did you change the default password on your router? Yeah, the response I would get is, I have a router? What's a router? I'm like, cable modem, high-speed internet. Oh yeah, that thing. I'm like, do you ever notice the sticker on the side had a password? Yeah, but who comes into my house? I'm like, the person who installed it came into your house for a few hours. Those kinds of things, we've seen a significant uptick. And I'll throw one more in before handing it off, not to give others. We also have a scenario when you really think about this pandemic, where our employees were isolated in their homes with family. A lot of family in certain regions, in certain areas where you had a really large concentration of people. So one of the other things that has kept me up at night and that we're working through solutions for is, in the past, I knew who you were. MFA be damned, right? That let me know I knew that you had the token, for example. I knew that you knew the PIN. I knew you knew the password, but how did I know it was really you? And what we've seen with a lot of companies out there is that they've run into a scenario where all the proper credentialing was provided on the asset that they provided, but it wasn't their employee. It was someone else in the household that was doing the work, and it caused risk. And so that who are you piece is also really raised concern for me.
Great. Neal, can we hear from you on this?
Sure. So what keeps me up at night? Until a couple months ago, I worked in the city that never sleeps. So the list of things that were keeping me up at night was pretty long. But now I live in a quieter town. I agree with some of the descriptions of vishing is certainly one that I've seen on an uptick. What has not changed is the motivations and the actors. I think it's pretty much still the same motivations, the same actors. People, I think it was Willie Sutton said, why do you rob a bank? What money is? So people attack banks for the same reasons. People attack pharma companies for the same reasons. It's pretty much the same actors. And they use variations that have been tailored to the COVID situation, work from home, that still rely on the same tried and true weaknesses. And unfortunately, a lot of the weaknesses they prey on are the users. and the user situation, and the control environment the user's working in, where it used to be in the office, now it's at home. That is different. So what do you see? You see phishing campaigns taking advantage of public anxieties. Click here to know if your next door neighbor has been infected with COVID, or click here for something that will help you feel better economically, or about your job, or about healthcare. A lot of anxieties going on right now, and I see phishing themes and criminal themes exploiting, drawing on those anxieties, but in the service of tactics that look familiar, just different themes, and still pretty much after the same thing. If there is a control that includes a callback number, for a validation or authentication, call me back here. You can see where fraudsters would say, well, I'm not at my office, so please call this number. And of course, that number is bogus. So those are out there. And again, they take advantage of human weaknesses, as opposed to technological weaknesses or humans. I wouldn't say it's a weakness. It's just, that's how humans behave if they're inclined to trust. So again, something else that hasn't changed is the role of the user in cybersecurity. It's always been important, but when you have users off the property and in the homes, and you have to rely on thoughtfulness in cybersecurity and securing their home systems, that emphasizes the role of the user in being part of your cybersecurity program, which emphasizes a very non-technology solution, which is education and awareness and communicating constantly to the users. Please look out for this. Please do 2 more steps on authentication if someone calls you and says, I'm not at my office, so call me at this number. I think that users, even if they're not cybersecurity specialists, if they have that education, have that awareness, first of all, it does make a difference, and we can see that. Second of all, it's not very expensive.
And I just have to throw one thing before Brian, and I know you're going to speak about this as well, but it's something you said. We talk about education, but one of the other areas that I think we need to increase, because the user is generally the people, let's be honest, we're the ones that cause most of the problems. We like to click links as human beings. We like to respond. If you think you're getting something from the CEO, you want to be that go get them kind of person. And our adversaries are quite well aware. So education helps, but I have a psychology background, not to get into history. So I have a perspective on education when it comes to cybersecurity. It's not the education that's going to really help us improve. It is, you have to do it, but you got to test people. We generally change and improve when we fail, right? That is a known psychological fact about human beings. We need to fail and feel that failure internally. So we have to test our people, and none of this nonsensical sending a phishing email to our employees that looks like it's in crayon, that has 42 misspellings and says, please grab the sock behind your washer. It's got $1 billion. Just send me 50. Nothing like that. They have to be hard, and they have to have immediate consequence. And I'm not talking punitive, but consequence. You have failed a phishing test. You must do these things. You must do education to really try to hit home so people can improve. Sorry, Brian, I know you were.
No, absolutely. It's about the psychology. We can train, and in the training environment, everybody gets a gold star. But when the psychology comes in, when there's an emotional reaction to that email or to that phone call, as you say, that's why we need the testing. We need people to get used to that. And it's the social engineering vectors. It's the phone call or the email. Hi, this is your IT department. We need to install some patches right away. Click this link. Right. That's the because the fraudsters, as everybody has said already, they're agile. They're responsive to the changes or the potential changes in our threat awareness. And these are the things we need to do. We need to enable our people to be resilient to the psychology-based attacks.
Yeah, and if I could just answer that from the communicator's lens. So we've talked about the importance of education and communication, and the psychology of reinforcing that. And I think that is so important. But as we've heard all of you talk about sort of new risks, new threats, new varietals of old existing threats, our clients that are best prepared are clients that are scenario planning all year long, and going back and looking what are those new threats and understanding as an organization under these types of scenarios, what is our response going to be? What are our trigger points for escalating? When, at what point do we need to engage law enforcement? Whose decision is it on escalation? And making these decisions in advance best you can, so that, you know, not if it happens, but when it happens, those decisions have been made and you can take the emotion out of it and act swiftly. And you know, you can set scenario plan 7 scenarios. It will always be the 8th, the 9th, the 10th, but at least you'll have that muscle memory of how you act as an organization and who's involved when, so that those issues are out of the way and you can move swiftly to remediation.
Only if you practice. Practice. Plans are only as good as the paper they're written on, and you have to practice. And you know, you ask about one of the other things about financial institutions, and I will be quiet, let Neal and Brian talk about their own experiences, but it's making sure that whatever corporate crisis function you have within your organization, how often are you practicing? Are you practicing the same thing over and over again? And finally, when it comes to the practicing, are you passing? Because if you pass a corporate crisis event, a scenario, then you've done it wrong. Again, you have to fail them. And you much rather fail your practice so that you can learn and reassess and reevaluate. Because I don't know how many people that are watching this and listening have ever been through one in real life, but I can promise you, if I'm in the middle of an IR situation, I'm not grabbing the book and flipping through it looking for the plan. And which step are we? I'm not doing that. Nobody's doing that. And it has to be, to your point, muscle memory.
Yeah, the plan is informative, but you've got to practice so that people have it in there, if not their short-term memory, that it's familiar to it. And part of that plan, though, and part of that practicing is making sure that you're not just doing a tabletop. You're not just doing it in isolation. One of my favorite books is called the Checklist Manifesto, and one of the lessons in it was from Boeing when they were building I think it was Boeing, when they were building the checklist for how to handle various in-flight situations and incidents. And I think it was the first test of it, the plane crashed. And so they had to change the checklist. First item of the checklist, fly the plane. Right? So when you're handling, you need to plan, but you need to practice so that you can continue to operate all your other controls, so that when you're distracted over here, the adversaries aren't coming in the other way.
Yeah, great. I guess I wanted to shift to the question of consumer data, because obviously there's so much danger there. It's also, I think, an interesting area where the 3 panelists here are different places in the ecosystem. And you know, I think one really interesting thing that's coming up is that people are shifting outside of traditional financial institutions. So, you know, we're seeing a lot of growth in the Venmos and the Zells, not even the Zells, which is sort of inside financial institutions, but the Venmos and the Square Cash App and Chime and neobanks. And, you know, a lot of them are generating data, don't necessarily have the same rules as traditional banks. And then you have the issue of data moving in between these institutions, and Yodlee is obviously one of the biggest players in that space of helping, you know, fintechs get data from banks and banks to get data from fintech. And I guess I just want to know how much this has been controversial in the past. You know, a lot of banks have not necessarily wanted to share their data with fintechs who had different security rules. How much has that become more of an issue as these non-bank institutions have ramped up? And I guess I'd be interested in starting with Neal, who's, you know, at a traditional financial institution and working our way through this question.
Well, it's very situation dependent too, every institution like mine and like my colleagues, and even outside of financial services, you know, we have our stakeholders, our partners, our collaborators, whatever you are, some of which share the same regulatory and compliance and security lens as we do and some that don't, and we all work together to collectively provide the value to the client. You start with basic questions. What do you have access to? What do you have access to in my infrastructure? What do you have access to in my data? What are you doing to protect it? I think that generally speaking, the security questions are better to lead off with on compliance than compliance questions anyway. Compliance are necessarily tied to a regulatory regime, and as you've kind of implied, not all members of the financial ecosystem are equally regulated by the same regulators. So you start with, well, what's a smart thing to do that industry recognizes? And you may or may not be a bank, but you're part of this industry. The fact of the matter is there's a reason why we're doing that. And there's a reason why we're connected to the internet. The best way to reduce cyber risks is just disconnect from the internet and fire all your users, which is not a very good strategy. It's certainly not a good business strategy, but it is effective. So you understand what it is we're trying to do, how we're trying to make money, how we're trying to provide value to the clients, and how we can do so in a secure way. But that starts with what I think is a good CISO question, a good CISO perspective to have, which is not, that seems insecure. No, try another way. It rather is to say, what are you trying to accomplish? Okay, well, the risks of doing that to your data are this, this, and this. So try doing it this way and tell me, is that really a lot of friction? Is that an inefficient way? Okay, we can try it this way. Can't try it that way. I'm just not comfortable with it. Of course, key to that is going back to the communication perspective, which is most importantly from a data protection perspective, is what are the client's expectations? Because I know what my expectations are because I do cybersecurity and been doing it for a long time. If my expectations on security are aligned with the client's expectations on how we're taking care of that person's data, then that's a very important perspective that adds to the pure efficiency perspective that we want to get from our ecosystem and our partners. So there's no magic solution. Unplugging from the internet is not the right answer. Abandoning controls for the win is not the right answer. But I think that's an approach of how you strike that balance.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, as you say, Nathaniel, Envestnet Yodlee operates a platform for consumer permission data sharing. So consumers engage with our clients who could be regulated financial institutions, could be less regulated technology companies. They permission the use of their data for some intention, say applying for a loan, getting some money coaching, helping them with an underfunded retirement situation. And then we connect on their behalf to the financial institution to bring the data down. There is asymmetry in the marketplace right now on the cybersecurity protections, on customer protections, and some of that's being addressed. So the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau put out a advanced notice of public rulemaking, asked 46 very good questions to help address some of these asymmetries. But what the pandemic has shown us in this shift to more digital engagements and causing some institutions to accelerate their deployment or scale up their use of digital engagements, certainly causing consumers to shift some of their behaviors to digital engagements we talked about, is that the need for collaboration and on the cybersecurity, on the customer protection needs to accelerate as well. We're operating in an environment of fragmented regulations. And the commercial ecosystem that we've developed it's pretty good. It's probably the best, the best it can be in some cases, given these inequities in the regulations and the various interpretations that the stakeholders have to make. But more needs to be done. Cybersecurity focus. I won't disagree with that. I think which probably means I do disagree with it. But compliance is important. I think we need to start with principles. I think if all the stakeholders, regardless of the compliance obligations that they have, the regulatory mandates that they have, if we go back to principles around putting the customer in the center of the experience, do no harm, sort of a digital Hippocratic oath, and if there is harm, the party that caused the harm or allowed the harm to happen is accountable. That's a good first step or a good touch point for us to then build some of the, start building the control programs and that we can then measure ourselves against. And financial services is obviously a crucible for this. We see it playing out in healthcare as well, and we'll soon see it in other non-entertainment areas like energy and telecommunications.
Great. And I guess, you know, to get even a little bit more specific on the consumer data front, I mean, you know, there's been a lot of discussion around the rules and laws that apply to data sharing between financial institutions, non-financial institutions. Do we have the rules and laws that we need on that front? Are we where we need to be on that?
No. The U.S. does not have a consumer data right. As citizens, as consumers, we don't have a constitutional right to privacy, and we don't have a right to access our data. And that's what the open banking movements are about. So, which is a implementation of an open data or a consumer data right. That right is that as a citizen or a consumer, I have the right to access all the data that my government or my institutions, financial institutions, have about me. I can permission its use. I can correct it. And the institution that is the steward of that data has obligations to protect it. We don't have that. We have fragmented sectoral privacy and prudential regulations in financial services and healthcare. Because of that, the financial service, the banks and the brokerages bear an unfair burden of liability right now in the ecosystem, which informs their risk posture and informs their participation in these programs. And we saw it play out in the pandemic with stimulus. Accessing, allowing non-bank actors into the SBA program to distribute stimulus payments is one example of that. So, this crisis has shined a light on the need for more connected, collaborative regulations.
Can I just ask briefly, Brian, what did that matter, or why did that matter that non-bank institutions were allowed to collect stimulus payments?
So many small businesses engage primarily with non-bank institutions or fintech lenders to run their business. And so if these otherwise qualified organizations weren't at the table for the first round of the disbursements, they couldn't, their customers were blocked, or certainly were at the end of the line for having their applications considered for the payments, because they didn't have existing relationships with Wall Street or Main Street lenders.
Matt, you want to jump in on that? Or on the laws on this? I guess Matt and Neal, I guess another way to put it, are you guys on the same page on the sort of where we are in the rules and laws when it comes to consumer data? I know you guys.
No, Brian didn't say anything controversial as far as I'm concerned. I think the controversy is going to be at what levels and what adoption rate. And it is a global problem because we're not the only country that doesn't have these. And then there are countries that have gone too far, making it very, very difficult for institutions to actually conduct business. And I've seen in other regions, and I don't want to get into the specific of which regions, where they've gone to a point where I believe the regulations have eroded the trust of the institutions that are within that region just because of the nature of the legislation. So he was spot on.
You can't regulate conduct, but they're trying to.
Okay. I guess one other question interesting to hear from with Edelman here is, when there are security issues, what do you think, are we in the right place with public disclosure about those security incidents? I feel like a lot of times we learn about data breaches from Brian Krebs instead of from the companies themselves. And I'm wondering, are we in the right place with that, or what has gone wrong when it comes to public disclosure of these sorts of things? And I don't know, Neal, if you're still with us, would be very interested to get started with you.
Sure. Do you want to start with me or Deidre?
Well, Neal, yeah, and
Sure.
Neal, and I'd be interested in having Deidre jump in after we hear from you guys.
Right. So, globally, there is starting to be a convergence of expectations that you disclose, when you should disclose, and how quickly and how much. I don't think society has settled on what the golden mean is. Like everything else in security, it's a balance. On one hand, I do think it's important to communicate what happened. I think transparency is absolutely important. Bad news does not age well like wine. On the other hand, what do you want to hear? Do you want to hear accuracy or speed? Because I can get up there if something happens in an institution, and before I joined UBS, I did incident response. I can get up there and say, yeah, something happened, and that's going to engender all sorts of questions. What happened? How do you know? How much data was lost? I don't know. Not right now. When will you know? I can't tell you. But what I can tell you is here's what we're doing to answer those questions, and here's what we do know. But there is an amount of time it takes to get that communication accurate. And sometimes speed does compromise accuracy, and sometimes accuracy takes a long time. So I think it's important to understand, again, what the regulators, what the public's, what the consumers' expectations are on what they want to hear when, and with what level of confidence. And you can strike that balance if you know what those expectations are. But in 5 hours, you're not going to know what's happened, let alone what the result was.
I think that's spot on, and we have, I guess building on my comment, you can't regulate conduct. That's a factor. There's also, I think a lot of disclosures aren't made under the heading of shareholder value, right? And well, if we don't know, we shouldn't say anything because we have a fiduciary duty to maintain shareholder value. And so I don't think it'll ever be harmonized, but it needs to be considered as a factor, in my opinion.
Well, and some of that work that I was talking about before in terms of preparedness, that you have thought through, what the trigger points are and when you're going to be able to disclose what, but you've also thought through the actions that you can be taking behind the scenes to mitigate worsening the situation while you get to the bottom of the truth. Like you can pull down all your digital advertising just like that. If you need to slow, if something has gone broken or something is leaking and you're wanting to not attract more and more people into the system while you sort things out. And you can control your narrative by having thought it through in advance, so that when you do come out with an announcement that says, we've got an issue, we're looking into it, until which time please proceed according to these steps. Then when you get to the bottom of it and you can come out and disclose transparently and comprehensively, you're going to want to like the way that sounds. And having thought through it in advance and then following those steps, that muscle memory, are going to help you come out of the back end having behaved in the way that is consistent with your values, that is transparent, and that is trust building. And that takes practice.
And we see that. Let's be honest. If you look at any of the major disclosures that have happened, the ones, the organizations that have had, and you can tell they practice it, everybody was on board. Whether they agreed or not is irrelevant. They were on board and they made the announcements. They followed a process. They were as transparent as they could be. And I can think of many examples, weathered that storm, right? And I would be willing to bet you large sums of money that I don't have. I'll bet Neal's money that that CISO, that PR executive, that CEO, that COO, their legal teams had all prepped for it and were all on the same page, and most likely had pre-authored certain statements to make sure they were ready to go should there be a crisis. And then you can flip around, and it would not take anybody that's listening to this a lot of Googling or Google searches to see which breaches went really, really poorly. And those are the ones that generally had really bad communication programs and announcements. They held it way too late. I mean, there's a major one going on right now in the United States that it wouldn't take long for you to find out. And it's all about communications. And to Neal's point, it doesn't have to be that we know everything going on. I've been also many an IR night in my career, and you don't know what's going on at all for the first X period of time. But that doesn't mean you should not, depending on the scenario, be ready to communicate.
Great. We've got just a few minutes left here. So I thought one potentially place to wrap things up might be to go through and discuss what you guys think. I mean, the financial service industries is, you know, ahead of the game in many ways on security, but are there things that the financial services industries can learn from other industries? You know, Mathew, I think you'd be a good place to start with that.
So it's an interesting question. I would actually leave the response to that to Neal and Brian being in the finance, but I actually think there are things other industries could learn from finance. I think most financial institutions have spent a considerable amount of time on their customer service, their secure customer service protocols and processes. Yes, at the beginning of this conversation, I brought up one particular one. It was a regional situation where normally I could take a drive to deal with that they just weren't prepared. But a lot of organizations, a lot of agencies, a lot of government entities, we've seen fail. And if they took a bit of a lesson on how banks, how financial institutions authenticate people, how they communicate out, you know, which industries sent out the "we will never ask for your password," right? That came out of finance. Those kinds of comms programs, pushing them out, the education programs that I've seen in a lot of financial institutions, I think other industries should be looking at and taking a lesson from finance, not potentially the other way around.
I think that's spot on. One of the industries that I think financial services is learning from and can continue to learn from is healthcare, specifically around de-identification of data and making that data useful, shareable, and allowing multiple parties to collaborate on it. One of the challenges that we have now in this connected ecosystem, but not fully connected ecosystem in financial services is that the data is that there's a lot of inherent risk in the data. Not all the actors have the, you know, have this, they might have the same principles, but they don't have the same wherewithal to protect the data uniformly end to end. De-identification is one very important tool to doing that. So that would be my number one.
So my response to that is a couple of thoughts. I mean, first of all, as a CISO, there's a lot I have to learn from my counterparts in other industries. And I think one thing that's important to note that I'm sure my colleagues would back me up on is how much CISOs communicate with each other, how much we talk to each other about what works, what doesn't, what should we be worried about? Man, this is a hard problem. Oh yeah, I don't have a solution, or you should check this out. But it's not, and to be sure, I speak with my counterparts in other comparably sized banks and financial institutions, but I also speak to them in pharma and in industrial controls, in manufacturing and automation, because that's the nature of who we are as security people, but also because I suspect that my problems look more like the problems of the CISO of a large global pharma company than it does a small regional bank in northwestern South Dakota. So there's a lot I can learn from people who have similar scale of problems and similar data challenges of cross-border data localization, so forth and so on. But in terms of what the industry has, I think that there's a lot that the financial services can learn from Internet of Things, especially the introduction of operational technology and industrial control systems into consumer technology and IT. You know, as firms, we don't have a lot of moving parts. As banks, we don't have a lot of moving parts. You've got some gates here and there. But we do have consumer technology. We have point of sale or ATM, and some experience plugging those into industrial control systems, other things. But when you see other, like even retailers, not just, you know, oil fields and manufacturing and assembly line plants, but retailers who have had some have had some unfortunate experiences of the unexpected networking of industrial control systems into IT and point of sale systems. But also, how is the Internet of Things evolving for consumer convenience? If you're hooking your refrigerator up to monitor your eggs and milk inventory, and then when you're running low, it automatically connects to a retailer to order, and then to your bank account pay for it, and then to your toaster to see how many slices of bread you've toasted in case you're running low on that. You can trust your bank account, but can you trust your toaster?
No. And I think with a good jab at a